They took him away when I was a kid. I lived with my parents and my brother in a small town. We always hung out with our cousins and the other kids around there from early in the morning until it got dark. We spent our time outside, walking from one place to another. Nobody watched us because our parents knew that at some point we would come back. They were calm, confident that we wouldn't get into trouble, so they didn't ask what we did. Meanwhile, when it was really hot, we went to the river. It wasn't far, maybe 100 meters. Since we were kids, they had taught us to swim, and many times our parents said it was better if we bathed for a while. We played, jumped off the rocks, and sometimes just floated without doing anything. There were never any adults with us, but that wasn't unusual. It had always been like that. That day, after being in the water for several hours, we decided to go back. We were already gathering our things when we heard voices, laughter, and the screams of children. It caught us off guard because we knew everyone in town, and those voices didn't sound familiar. We turned around to see where they were coming from, but we saw no one. The laughter continued. At first, it sounded far away, but then it seemed to be getting closer. It moved without a fixed direction, sometimes between the trees, then behind the bushes, then higher up as if coming from the air. There was something strange about it, a tone that didn't sound normal. We didn't know what to think, but it made us nervous. My brother seemed restless, but he was also curious. He said we should go see who they were. I wasn't sure if it was a good idea, but I followed him. We approached carefully, moving the branches aside. That's when we saw them. There were several children among the trees. We didn't know them. They were wearing old clothes, as if from another time. They seemed to be playing, but their movements weren't natural. It was as if they were imitating the game rather than truly having fun. Their laughter continued, but it didn't come from their mouths. We could hear it, yet their lips barely moved. We crouched behind a fallen tree trunk so we could watch them without being seen. Suddenly, they all turned at the same time and looked toward the river. They stopped moving and laughing. Then, without hesitation, they walked straight into the water. They didn't splash, didn't play, they just moved forward until they were completely submerged. They stayed underwater longer than normal. They didn't come up. We waited, but we didn't see any bubbles, no movement on the surface. We couldn't even tell if they were holding their breath because they didn't seem to be there at all. Something didn't add up. They looked like children, but there was something about them that wasn't normal. My brother didn't take his eyes off them. He said they looked like they were having a good time, that they seemed entertained. He watched them play and sometimes laughed softly, as if pleased to see them. But at one point, they stopped moving. They just stood there, looking at us. They didn't blink. They didn't talk. They just stared. Then suddenly, they raised their arms and motioned for my brother to come closer. At first, it was slow, as if they were calmly inviting him. But then, they moved their hands faster, signaling him to come. My brother wanted to go, but I grabbed him by the arm. I told him it was getting late. He didn't respond immediately. He just kept looking at the children as if they were calling him without words. He insisted that he didn't see the problem, that he just wanted to see them up close to know who they were. I didn't let go. He frowned, getting a little angry, but he didn't say anything else. Then the children stopped moving. Their faces lost all expression. They weren't smiling, but they didn't seem upset either. Just strange. They kept staring at us, unblinking, and suddenly, without warning, they started throwing stones at us. The stones weren't very big, but they came fast, with force. We didn't hesitate. We turned and ran without looking back. We didn't stop until we caught up with the other kids from town. None of them believed us when we told them what had happened. They said maybe it was a prank, that maybe those were just mischievous children from another place. After that day, we continued going to the river as usual. But we started to notice something. Those children were never there in the morning or in the afternoon. They only appeared when the sun was setting, always between 7:30 and 8 at night. Right at that time, they would come. We would sit on the shore, keeping our distance, watching them from afar. They never spoke to each other, but they played. They never looked at us, never acknowledged our presence, as if we weren't there at all. But one day, that changed. That evening, when the sun was almost gone, The children suddenly stopped playing. They stood still. But now they weren't looking at the two of us. They were only looking at my brother. And then they began to call his name. They didn't say anything else. They didn't talk to anyone else. Just him. It wasn't a desperate or loud call. It was calm, patient, like they were waiting for him. Like they knew that, at some point, he was going to go with them. My brother didn't react immediately. He just stared at them, his mouth half open, as if he didn't know what to do. I tugged at his sleeve. I told him it was late, that we had to go. He stood still for a moment. Then slowly, he nodded and walked away with me. We didn't say anything on the way home, but that night, when we went to bed, I heard him tossing and turning, restless, unable to sleep. From that day on, every time we went to the river, my brother searched for them with his eyes. Sometimes I saw him tense up when they arrived. Other times, he just stood still as if waiting for them to call his name again. But they never did. They were just there on the riverbank at the same time as always. And from time to time, they would glance at him, watching him from the corner of their eyes. Then, my brother disappeared. That morning, my mother had left early to visit some relatives in another town. I thought she would be gone for a while, so I went to play in the woods with my friends. My brother didn't come with us. He never liked the woods. That day, I had suggested we go there instead of the river. He didn't want to. He said maybe he'd catch up with us later, but I knew he wouldn't. He never did. When I got home, my mother was already there. She looked upset. She asked me where he was. I told her he was probably at the river. He hadn't come with us. She stared at me, her face pale. Then she said she had heard him leave that morning toward the river. She said she had heard when we yelled that we were going to the woods. She knew. She knew he wouldn't have gone with us. We ran outside to look for him. We went to the river first. There was no one there. My mother started calling his name louder and louder. Then she began to cry. Soon the neighbors found out. They joined us to help search. But nobody found him. One neighbor said he had seen something moving in the bushes. He said it sounded like children running. But when he tried to get a better look, there was nothing there. Another said he had heard laughter near the shore. But as he got closer, the laughter faded away, and my brother was never seen again. An older man joined the conversation and said that these things had happened before. For years, he said, several children had gone missing and none of them ever came back. That night, we searched for my brother without stopping. When dawn broke, they called the authorities, but he was still missing. That was when I decided to tell my parents about the children who came to the river at night. As soon as they heard me, their expressions changed. My mother said that those weren't children, that they belonged to the river. She said that if they appeared to you, it meant they were calling you. My father added that you should never answer them, never even look at them. He said that the other children who had disappeared before had also mentioned seeing them. He said the Chaniks did this. They took children away forever. After my brother was gone, I returned to the river many times. I stayed in the same area where we used to play, hoping to see those children again to understand what had happened, but they never came back. They take what they want. My parents had been looking for a place to escape the noise and chaos of the city. They didn't want to be near busy streets filled with cars or towering buildings. After much thought, they decided to buy a house in a quiet, secluded town with little activity. By then, I was already around 30 years old. The house was old, built of stone and wood. The ceilings were high and the windows were large, yet the light never seemed to enter properly. Over time, the vegetation had begun to swallow it up. The trees grew so close that some branches touched the walls, their thick roots creeping beneath the foundation. What worried me most was how isolated it was. The main road was far away, which meant that if we ever needed help, it would take a long time to arrive. From the first night, something felt off. At first, I thought the noises were normal, just the house settling, the wind rustling through some forgotten corner. I didn't give them much importance. I convinced myself that there was no reason to be afraid, so I turned off the lamp beside my bed. The hours stretched longer than usual. In the middle of the night, a noise from the kitchen woke me up. Something had moved. I got up carefully and went down the stairs as quietly as possible. When I reached the kitchen, I felt a strange air, a coldness that hadn't been there before. I wasn't alone. I stood still for a moment, scanning the room. At first glance, there was no one, but the plates I had left on the table were now on the floor. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Finally, I picked up the plates, set them back in place, and returned to my room. At dawn, I told my parents what had happened. They didn't seem concerned. It was probably the wind, they said, or a draft. I didn't insist. The day passed quietly. In the afternoon, I was reading while my parents worked in the garden. Everything felt calm, but as the sun began to set and the light faded, something caught my attention. In the window of my room, which was on the second floor, I saw a figure. At first glance, it looked like the shadow of a child staring at me. It didn't make sense. I blinked several times and looked again. Nothing. Everything was quiet again. That night, the noises weren't in the kitchen. Now I heard footsteps. This time, I didn't go toward the sound. Instead, I stood still on the stairs, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from. The footsteps grew clearer. They were getting closer. Then, just before reaching me, they stopped. I strained my eyes in the dim light, and that was when I saw it. A small figure, barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't taller than a child, but its skin was wrong, a dry, cracked color, like parched earth, not like human skin, something that should not be there. Fear paralyzed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. The figure stood still for a long moment. It didn't breathe. It didn't twitch. Then, without warning, it moved, so fast that I could barely follow it. In the blink of an eye, it was gone, vanished without a trace. The only thing left was the overwhelming certainty that something was very wrong. I didn't wait any longer. I ran up the stairs and locked my door, barricading it with whatever I could find. I spent the entire night awake, waiting for dawn. I didn't dare close my eyes, not even for a second. Every noise, even the smallest creak, sent a shiver through my body. When morning finally came, I decided to go to the town market. I was sure I would find a stall selling charms or protective amulets. I didn't know much about these things, but I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for things to get worse. It was obvious that what was happening in the house didn't have a logical explanation. Maybe someone in town would know what to do. At the market, I found a man tending to a small stall. I told him everything. While I spoke, he watched me carefully, as if trying to understand something beyond my words. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then, he asked if I was from the area. I told him no. I didn't understand why that mattered. After a long pause, he said something I wasn't expecting. He told me that what was happening in the house had nothing to do with witchcraft or spirits. "It's not even something strange," he said. "It's the opposite." To him, this was normal. Just a part of life in that place. He explained that Sheneks lived in that house, and that nothing could be done. He told me that long before people built homes there, Sheneks had already claimed the land. They had always been there. He assured me that this wasn't new, and it wasn't something that could be stopped. According to him, the real invaders weren't them, it was us. His explanation unsettled me, but it didn't change the most important thing. Whatever was in that house, it was terrifying. It didn't matter if they were harmless. It didn't matter if they had been there first. They were still something that should not be inside a house. And just because they were small didn't mean they weren't monsters. And monsters are monsters. There was no way to predict how things would change. That night, everything was different. Until then, what had happened had left me restless, uneasy. But that night was something else entirely. As soon as midnight came, the noises returned, but they weren't the same. This time, they were louder, more frequent. It wasn't just a single sound, but several coming from different parts of the house. I heard distant laughter, and then bangs, loud, deliberate strikes against the walls and floor as if something unseen was moving through the house. At a certain moment, the atmosphere became unbearable. It no longer made sense to stay locked in my room, so I decided to leave. I walked down the hallway in silence, moving cautiously toward the living room, and that's when I saw him. The damned Shenek stood in the center of the room, staring at me directly. But he wasn't alone. Now there were several of them. I couldn't say how much time passed as those creatures remained there, unmoving, their small, unnatural forms blending with the shadows. Then, one by one, they slipped away, vanishing into the darkness. until the room was empty again. When the day came, I knew what I had to do. There was no other option. I had to leave. I didn't waste a second wondering if my parents would be okay in that house. I only remembered what the townspeople had said. The Sheniks weren't a real danger. If they had lived their entire lives with them and were certain of their harmlessness, then I had no reason to doubt them. I was completely wrong. Not even a year had passed when my mother called me with news I never expected. My father was in the hospital. I asked what had happened, but she refused to tell me over the phone. "Just come soon," she said. "We'll talk at the hospital." I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my car keys and drove as fast as I could. Once there, I spoke to the doctors. They assured me that my father's condition wasn't critical, but it was serious enough not to be taken lightly. With surgery and proper treatment, along with at least 2 weeks of hospital rest, he was expected to recover and walk out without issue. Hearing that, my mind eased, if only slightly. Then I went to find my mother, desperate for the real story. She told me that, over time, they had grown used to the presence of the Sheniks in the house. At first, they were uneasy, but as the days passed, they stopped fearing them. The creatures never did more than harmless pranks, or so they thought. What they didn't realize was that those beings weren't as harmless as everyone said. My father had ended up in the hospital because of them, because of a direct attack. According to my mother, it all started when one of the Sheniks tried to take a ring, one that had belonged to my grandmother, left to my father as an inheritance before she died. The moment he noticed, he reacted instantly, attempting to grab it from the creature's hands. But as soon as he did, 2 more appeared. 3 Sheniks in total, and together they attacked him with all their strength. It happened so fast that my mother couldn't react. By the time she realized what was happening, my father was already on the ground, unable to move. Only then did the Sheniks stop their attack. And yes, they took the ring, without anyone being able to stop them.